In a small, forgotten shelter nestled against the backdrop of an autumn forest, a frail puppy on the brink of death found an unlikely guardian, a graying golden retriever. But what unfolded next was nothing short of miraculous. Before we dive into this heartwarming tale of love, loyalty, and second chances, make sure you subscribe for more stories that celebrate the extraordinary bond between animals and humans. Now, let's begin. The old animal shelter, nestled on the edge of a sleepy town, was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Autumn had brought its cold winds, and the small building seemed to groan under the weight of the season. Inside, the animals huddled in their kennels, while Grace, the shelter's primary caretaker, walked through the dimly lit corridors, checking on her furry charges. Rusty, an aging golden retriever, lay on a worn blanket near the shelter's entrance. His once lustrous coat was now speckled with gray, his movements slower than they used to be. But his eyes, warm, wise, and ever watchful, missed nothing. He had become the heart of the shelter, offering quiet companionship to every new arrival. Grace paused by Rusty, scratching behind his ears. "You're my little miracle worker, aren't you?" she murmured. Rusty thumped his tail gently in response. She sighed, her breath visible in the chilly air. Donations had dwindled and the shelter was struggling. "I just hope we can keep going," she whispered to herself before moving on. The night descended, bringing with it a storm. Rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the cracks in the old walls. Grace was about to lock up for the night when she heard a faint scratching at the door. Frowning, she opened it to find a soggy cardboard box on the porch. Inside the box was a tiny puppy shivering uncontrollably. His fur was patchy, his eyes barely open. Grace gasped, immediately wrapping him in her scarf and rushing him inside. "Oh, you poor thing," she said, her voice cracking. She placed him on the examination table and began drying him with a towel. "Matt," she called to her assistant, who had been in the back sorting supplies. Matt hurried in, his eyes widening at the sight of the puppy. "Is he alive?" "Barely," Grace replied. She listened to the puppy's shallow breaths. "We'll call him Buddy." Rusty, lying by the door, raised his head at the sound of Grace's voice. His ears perked as he caught sight of the tiny, trembling bundle on the table. Slowly, he got to his feet, his joints creaking with effort, and padded closer. Grace noticed him and smiled faintly. "Not this time, Rusty," she said gently. "He's too weak." But Rusty stood his ground, his gaze fixed on Buddy. "I think he wants to help," Matt said, watching the old dog with curiosity. Grace hesitated, then shook her head. "No, Buddy needs rest and warmth. Rusty might be too much for him right now." Rusty seemed to understand and lay down near Buddy's kennel, his eyes never leaving the puppy. The storm raged outside as the shelter settled into an uneasy quiet. The next morning, Grace found Rusty lying right against Buddy's kennel. The puppy was curled in a tight ball, his breathing shallow. Grace knelt to check on him, her heart sinking. "He's not improving," she said softly to Matt, who had joined her. Rusty let out a soft whine, pawing at the kennel. "Maybe we should let him in," Matt suggested. Grace frowned. "I don't know. Buddy's so fragile." "Rusty's always had a way with the others," Matt pointed out. "What's the harm in trying?" Reluctantly, Grace unlocked the kennel. Rusty carefully stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He lay down beside Buddy, his large frame curling protectively around the tiny puppy. Buddy stirred, letting out a faint whimper before settling against Rusty's warm coat. The sight brought tears to Grace's eyes. It's like he knows exactly what to do. For the rest of the day, Rusty stayed with Buddy. The puppy seemed calmer, his breathing more even. Grace and Matt took turns checking on them, but it was clear that Rusty had taken on the role of guardian. As the days passed, Buddy began to show small signs of improvement. He opened his eyes more often, ate tiny portions of food, and even managed to wag his tail faintly when Rusty was near. The bond between the two was undeniable. Rusty's presence seemed to give Buddy the strength to keep fighting. Grace found herself sitting with them during quiet moments, reflecting on how much Rusty had done for the shelter. "You're amazing," she whispered to him one evening, scratching his graying fur. Rusty glanced up at her with his soulful eyes, as if to say it was simply his duty. One particularly cold night, Buddy took a turn for the worse. His tiny body shivered uncontrollably, and his breathing became labored. Grace stayed up with him, her worry growing with each passing hour. Rusty, too, seemed distressed, pacing outside the kennel and whining softly. Finally, Grace opened the kennel door. "Go ahead, Rusty," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Rusty stepped inside and lay down, pulling Buddy close with his front paws. The puppy whimpered, but as Rusty's warmth surrounded him, he began to relax. Grace and Matt watched in awe as Rusty cradled Buddy through the night, his steady heartbeat a lifeline for the fragile pup. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the shelter windows, casting a warm glow over the kennel. Grace rubbed her tired eyes and looked over at Rusty and Buddy. To her amazement, Buddy was breathing steadily, his tiny chest rising and falling with newfound strength. "Look at him," Matt said softly, joining her. Grace knelt by the kennel, her heart swelling with hope. "Rusty, you did it," she whispered. The old dog opened his eyes, his expression calm and proud. Buddy stirred, lifting his tiny head to look at Rusty. His tail wagged faintly, the first real sign of life they had seen since his arrival. Grace leaned her head against the kennel bars, tears streaming down her face. "You're a miracle worker, Rusty," she said, her voice trembling. Rusty thumped his tail once, his gaze never leaving Buddy. In that moment, it was clear that he had found his final mission, saving the life of a helpless puppy who now had a fighting chance. Rusty and Buddy quickly became the heart of the shelter, their bond inspiring everyone who witnessed it. Buddy, though still fragile, began to show signs of life under Rusty's constant care. The old golden retriever had taken on the role of a guardian, rarely leaving Buddy's side. Whenever Buddy whimpered in his sleep, Rusty was there, nuzzling him gently until the tiny puppy settled. Grace marveled at their connection. She had seen dogs form friendships before, but there was something extraordinary about Rusty and Buddy. "It's as if Rusty knows exactly what Buddy needs," she said to Matt one chilly morning as they prepared breakfast for the shelter animals. Matt chuckled, carrying a bucket of kibble. "Rusty's got a sixth sense for this stuff. I think he understands more than we give him credit for." Buddy's recovery wasn't immediate. It was slow and painstaking, with small victories marking each day. At first, it was just an extra wag of his tail when Rusty came near. Then it was the way his tiny legs trembled less when he stood. Grace noted every milestone, her heart swelling with hope. One afternoon, as the golden light of the setting sun poured into the shelter, Buddy took his first steps outside his kennel. Rusty watched from his usual spot near the entrance, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Grace knelt nearby, encouraging the puppy with soft words. "You can do it, Buddy," she whispered. Buddy's legs wobbled as he stepped cautiously forward. He stumbled once, his tiny frame shaking, but Rusty padded over and nudged him gently with his nose. Encouraged by Rusty's presence, Buddy took another shaky step, then another. Grace clapped her hands in delight, tears pricking her eyes. "He's doing it," she said to Matt, who had stopped in his tracks to watch the scene unfold. "Yeah," Matt replied, a grin spreading across his face. "He's got the best coach around." As the days turned into weeks, Buddy grew stronger. He began to eat more and even play with Rusty's old toys, a chewed-up tennis ball and a stuffed rabbit missing an ear. Rusty, ever patient, would lie nearby watching as Buddy batted at the toys with his small paws. Sometimes Buddy would drag the rabbit over to Rusty, as if inviting him to join in. Grace often sat with them during these moments, her mind drifting back to Rusty's own story. He had come to the shelter years ago, rescued from a flooded town where he had been left stranded on a rooftop. The townspeople spoke of how he had barked tirelessly until someone noticed him, saving not only himself but also a litter of kittens huddled beside him. "Rusty," "You've always been a hero, haven't you?" Grace said one evening, scratching his graying muzzle as Buddy dozed off beside him. Rusty leaned into her touch, his eyes soft and knowing. But even heroes grow weary. Grace began to notice that Rusty was slowing down. His movements were stiffer, and he rested more often than before. She worried silently, not wanting to voice her fears to Matt. One frosty morning, as she was cleaning the kennels, she spotted Rusty lying in a patch of sunlight near Buddy. The puppy was gnawing on the stuffed rabbit, occasionally glancing up at his guardian. Rusty's eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and steady. "He's tired," Grace murmured, leaning against the kennel bars. Matt, who had come in with fresh bedding, nodded. "He's put everything into Buddy. Maybe too much." Grace sighed. "I know, but I don't think he'd have it any other way." The weather turned colder as winter approached, and Grace worried about how the shelter would fare in the freezing temperatures. The building was old, and the heating system unreliable. One night, as the wind howled outside, she decided to take Rusty and Buddy home with her. "They need a warm place," she told Matt as they loaded the dogs into her car. "Rusty especially. He deserves to be comfortable." Matt nodded. "A good call. He's done enough for everyone else. It's time someone did something for him." Grace's small house, nestled at the edge of town, was cozy and warm. She set up a bed for Rusty by the fireplace and another for Buddy nearby. But Buddy, as expected, ignored his bed entirely, curling up next to Rusty instead. The two dogs quickly adjusted to the new environment. Rusty, ever calm, settled into his spot by the fire, while Buddy explored cautiously. Grace watched as Buddy mimicked Rusty's every move, from stretching out his legs to wagging his tail in a slow, measured rhythm. "He looks up to you," she told Rusty one evening, watching the old dog gently nudge Buddy toward the food bowl. "You're not just his friend, you're his teacher." One evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Buddy made a breakthrough. Grace had left a squeaky toy on the rug, and Buddy, who had been too weak to play just weeks ago, pounced on it with newfound energy. He squeaked it repeatedly, his tail wagging furiously. Rusty, lying nearby, lifted his head to watch. Buddy dragged the toy over to him, dropping it by his paws and barking, a small, sharp sound that made Grace laugh out loud. "Well, that's a first," she said, wiping a tear from her eye. Rusty gave Buddy a gentle nuzzle, his eyes filled with pride. But as the night wore on, Grace noticed that Rusty seemed more tired than usual. His breathing was heavier, and he shifted uncomfortably as he lay by the fire. "Are you okay, old man?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. Rusty blinked at her, his gaze steady but tired. Buddy, sensing something was wrong, snuggled closer to Rusty, resting his tiny head on the older dog's paw. Grace felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched them, their bond stronger than ever. The next morning, Rusty seemed better, his energy restored somewhat. But Grace knew it was only a matter of time. Rusty had given everything he had to Buddy, and while the puppy was thriving, the old dog was growing weaker. Still, Rusty showed no signs of regret. Every moment he spent with Buddy was filled with quiet joy, his wagging tail a testament to his unyielding spirit. Grace couldn't help but admire him, knowing that he had found his purpose in those final days. To guide Buddy toward a future he could face on his own. Rusty and Buddy had settled into a quiet routine at Grace's home. Rusty spent most of his time resting by the fireplace while Buddy explored every corner of the house with newfound energy. Grace couldn't help but smile as she watched them, the young puppy mirroring the older dog's movements and actions. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Grace sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her emails. A thought crossed her mind, and she opened the shelter's website. "They deserve a home," she whispered, her eyes flicking toward the dogs curled up by the fire. She began typing a post recounting the story of Rusty and Buddy, the miraculous recovery of the puppy and the selfless devotion of the elderly golden retriever. With each word, she felt a mix of hope and sadness, knowing the shelter couldn't keep them forever but wanting to find the perfect family. The post went live that afternoon, accompanied by a picture of Rusty and Buddy lying together. Within hours, Grace's phone buzzed with notifications. People from all over town were commenting and sharing their admiration for the bond between the two dogs. Among the messages was one that caught Grace's attention. It was from Clara and Frank, an elderly couple who had recently lost their beloved golden retriever. They wrote about how they missed having a dog but didn't feel ready to adopt until they saw the story of Rusty and Buddy. Grace read the email aloud to Matt. They said they're not looking for a replacement for their dog, but they want to meet Rusty and Buddy because they feel a connection. Matt grinned. Sounds promising. When are they coming by? Tomorrow afternoon, Grace replied, a flicker of hope lighting her eyes. The next day, Clara and Frank arrived at Grace's house. They were a warm, kind-looking couple, their hands intertwined as they stepped inside. Clara's eyes immediately softened when she saw Rusty. The old dog lifted his head from the rug and wagged his tail slowly, his gaze calm and inviting. "Oh, you're a handsome boy," Clara said, kneeling down to stroke his graying muzzle. Rusty leaned into her touch, his eyes half closing in contentment. Buddy, curious about the visitors, peeked out from behind Rusty before bounding forward with a wagging tail. Frank laughed as the puppy tried to climb up his leg. "This little guy's got some spunk," he said, reaching down to scratch behind Buddy's ears. Grace watched the interaction, her heart swelling. Rusty seemed completely at ease with Clara, while Buddy was clearly smitten with Frank. "They're inseparable," Grace explained as Clara sat on the floor beside Rusty. "Rusty has been like a father to Buddy, and Buddy, well, he's given Rusty a new sense of purpose." Frank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We can't separate them, can we?" Clara smiled. "No, we can't. They've been through too much together." By the end of their visit, Clara and Frank had made their decision. They wanted to adopt both dogs. Grace felt a mix of relief and sadness as she helped them prepare for the transition. She knew Rusty and Buddy would be in good hands, but parting with them still tugged at her heart. The following morning, Clara and Frank returned with a large dog bed, blankets, and toys for their new family members. Buddy wagged his tail furiously as they entered, while Rusty greeted them with a soft nuzzle. Grace knelt beside Rusty, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You've done so much for everyone, old boy. Now it's time for someone to take care of you." Rusty licked her hand gently as if to say he understood. Clara and Frank's home was a cozy farmhouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and woods. Rusty settled in quickly, finding a spot near the fireplace that reminded him of Grace's house. Buddy, on the other hand, dashed from room to room, exploring every corner. The couple had prepared 2 beds side by side, but as expected, Buddy ignored his, curling up next to Rusty instead. Clara chuckled as she watched them. "I don't think he's ever going to sleep alone," she said. Frank nodded, and Rusty wouldn't have it any other way. Over the weeks that followed, Buddy blossomed in his new home. He grew stronger and more playful, his tail wagging constantly as he darted around the yard. Rusty, though slower, seemed to draw energy from the peaceful environment. He enjoyed short walks with Frank and naps under the oak tree in their backyard. One sunny afternoon, Clara and Frank decided to plant a tree in their yard to honor Rusty. They chose a dogwood, its delicate flowers a symbol of resilience and beauty. Frank dug the hole while Clara tied a small plaque to the tree's trunk. The plaque read, "In honor of Rusty, a selfless heart and true friend." As they stood back to admire their work, Rusty lay in the shade of the tree, his eyes closed in peaceful contentment. Buddy sat beside him, wagging his tail as if sensing the significance of the moment. The days at Clara and Frank's farmhouse unfolded in quiet contentment. Buddy grew stronger with each passing week, his energy seemingly endless. He darted through the open fields, chased butterflies, and even managed to steal a sock or two from Frank's laundry basket. Rusty, however, was slowing down. He preferred to nap under the dogwood tree, his favorite spot in the yard. Clara often watched them from the kitchen window. "Rusty's earned this rest," she said to Frank one morning as they sipped their coffee. "He's given Buddy everything he had." Frank nodded. "And look at Buddy now. That's Rusty's legacy, a strong, happy pup who wouldn't be here without him. One crisp fall afternoon, Clara decided to take Rusty and Buddy to the nearby community park. It was a sunny day with golden leaves carpeting the ground. Buddy bounded ahead, tugging on the leash excitedly, while Rusty walked at his own pace beside Frank. As they strolled through the park, people stopped to admire the dogs. A little girl approached, her eyes lighting up as Buddy licked her hand. "What's his name?" she asked. "This is Buddy," Clara replied with a smile. "And this is Rusty, his best friend." The girl crouched down to pet Rusty, who wagged his tail slowly. Her parents, standing nearby, overheard Clara explaining the story of how Rusty had saved Buddy's life. Soon a small crowd gathered, drawn to the tale of love and resilience. By the end of the day, Clara and Frank found themselves surrounded by people offering donations for the local shelter and asking how they could help. Clara realized that Rusty and Buddy's story wasn't just about the bond between two dogs, it was a message of hope and kindness that resonated with everyone. Back at the farmhouse, Buddy seemed to sense that Rusty was growing weaker. He spent more time lying beside the older dog, nudging him gently whenever he seemed tired. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Buddy refused to leave Rusty's side. Clara and Frank noticed the change. They wrapped Rusty in a soft blanket and sat with him by the fireplace. Buddy curled up beside him, resting his small head on Rusty's paws. "Thank you for everything, old boy," Frank whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Rusty's breathing was slow but steady. His eyes, though tired, were filled with calm and gratitude. As the night wore on, his breaths grew softer until, with one final exhale, he drifted into a peaceful sleep. The farmhouse felt different without Rusty. Buddy, though lively as ever, occasionally paused by the dogwood tree, staring up at its branches as if searching for his old friend. Clara and Frank took extra care to comfort Buddy, showering him with love and attention. One evening, as Buddy lay by the fireplace, Clara brought out a framed photograph of Rusty. She placed it on the mantel, above the dogwood plaque Frank had etched weeks earlier. "Rusty would be proud of you," she said softly, stroking Buddy's fur. Buddy licked her hand, his tail wagging gently. It was as if he understood every word. As time passed, Buddy grew into a strong, loyal companion. He became a favorite in the community, attending fundraising events for the shelter and inspiring others to adopt animals in need. Clara and Frank often shared Rusty's story, emphasizing the impact one act of kindness can have. Buddy's playful energy brought warmth to their home, but it was his calm, steady presence that reminded them of Rusty. Whenever Clara felt overwhelmed or Frank grew tired from working on the farm, Buddy would nudge them gently, offering comfort in his quiet, unspoken way. One summer afternoon, Clara and Frank hosted a gathering at the farmhouse to celebrate the shelter's anniversary. Grace and Matt were among the guests, thrilled to see Buddy thriving. The dogwood tree, now taller and stronger, stood as a centerpiece in the yard, its branches casting a gentle shade. "Rusty would have loved this," Grace said, smiling as she watched Buddy play with the children. Frank placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's still here, in everything Buddy does." That evening, as the guests left and the farmhouse grew quiet, Buddy settled under the dogwood tree. The stars twinkled above, and the gentle breeze rustled the leaves. Clara and Frank watched from the porch, their hands intertwined. "He's carrying on Rusty's legacy," Clara said. "And doing a darn good job of it," Frank replied. Buddy lay peacefully under the tree, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It was as if he knew Rusty was watching over him, guiding him to carry forward the love and strength that had saved him all those months ago.